everyone. This is your life coach Nida, and you're joining me on Pondering Thoughts with Nida Javed. I have a very special guest with me today, David Pope, joining me from Kent, UK, on Pondering Thoughts with Nida Javed. He is sharing his struggle and battle with depression, anxiety, and suicidal mindset that eventually led him to the journey of discovering coping mechanisms and strategies to deal with it all. He is now a private counselor specifically dealing with depression and anxiety. Thank you so much, David, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really good to be here.
Good to have you. Now, before I introduce our topic, I want all of our audience to hit subscribe, click that icon button so you never miss my special guests and the pondering thoughts I keep bringing you. With that, let me tell you what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about men and their emotional health, depression, anxiety, and again, the suicidal mindset. Men don't cry. They are told as they are growing up, but that needs to change. And men also need to feel their emotions are also deserving of validation and should not be dismissed. David, let's start with your story. I appreciate you using your story for shedding the light on this very important topic.
Well, my struggles with mental illness started when I was probably around 6 years old.
Mhm.
So I remember quite vividly being at primary school and something just not feeling quite right. And I didn't know what it was. And, this was all new to me. But something felt off. And this feeling was exacerbated by teachers. So the teachers at the time would take me aside and would say, you look very isolated, you look very withdrawn, you look very alone with your thoughts. And I didn't quite know how to deal with these messages. So I think what happened, without apportioning blame, because I think they did what they could, but I think that these kind of messages were constantly installed. I sort of began to take on this kind of depressive persona. I remember, again, quite clearly being in a classroom or being in the playground or being even at home and just feeling totally and utterly alone. It was quite withdrawn as a result. I mean, I was a boy of few words, but I did have passions. I was passionate about sport. I was passionate about music. I was passionate about chess. So the things that I was already at that age very, very keen on. I was quite a keen musician even at that age. It was evident that things weren't right, and it kind of created a roadmap for my battles with depression, anxiety, and later on suicidal ideation.
Teenage years, what was your mindset then? And when was it exactly that you were experiencing suicidal thoughts?
I would say that as time went on, as I got older, the symptoms got worse. So when I hit teens, I was really starting to go down a bad rabbit hole. I would say suicidal ideation began probably around 15, 16.
Okay.
And it didn't quite have the intensity that it took on when I hit 20s, 30s, 40s, but it certainly was evident. I always pinpointed that it sort of began at school, but as life progressed, it became more and more and more intensive. So I was relentlessly bullied at school, both primary and secondary, which again fueled this torture which was going on in my head. And as I approached late teens, again, the suicidal tendencies really took off. Anxiety really took off. So yeah, I would say as I got older, the symptoms got progressively worse.
So, if I may ask, what was happening in your environment that was fueling this thought?
Mm.
And then you came to think this is the solution.
I always think about the fact that I have clinical depression in that it's just the way I am. But I also feel that life events have triggered me and have exacerbated my mental illness. So I would say it's a combination of circumstantial and clinical. And I would say that it got to a point where I probably hit my 30s, late 30s. Along the way, I had accrued a lot of techniques and coping mechanisms to survive, because it was, either a case of live or die, essentially.
Mm.
And it became necessary to find ways to survive. And I found that as I progressed into my 40s, I really became obsessed with the whole idea of recovery and daily routines, daily techniques, daily strategies to just keep on top of this dark cloud.
All right. So what I'm hearing you say is from suicidal ideology mindset, you are moving towards survival mindset. Now, explain that to me because it's either, clinical, circumstantial. It's hard. I can only imagine how both of them can work in a person's body. I want to learn a little bit more about survival mindset. What was your motivation? What is saying life needs to be given a chance?
It comes from one's will. It comes from one's
Translate
will.
that.
Um, I come across a lot of people with depression. And if someone can't get out of bed, I can make a number of suggestions to help them get out of bed. But they have to have the will. Now, the thing is, depression is so overwhelming and it's such a big black cloud. It takes a lot of inner strength. It takes a lot of inner resources to get to that point of intention. It all starts with intention. And it's a huge gap between the suffering and the intention. So I came up with this thing called a rating system. So very often, if I'm having a really bad day, I like to rate my depression. I like to give it a number out of 10. And if it's particularly intensive, I'll say to myself, okay, I've got to shave it off. I've got to just take off the edge of this depression. And then I'll reduce it by doing X, Y, or Z, which, we can come to later. And that will motivate me to reduce it further, because if I can reduce it by one small step, then I can reduce it by another small step. So going back to your question, human beings need to be rewarded. We struggle to be motivated unless there's some sort of direct reward. So I would say that developing the ability to seek out a technique to reduce your depression requires that sort of inner wanting. The wanting has to be there, because I've spent so much of my life giving advice to people, but a lot of the time it doesn't get taken on board because they haven't got that will, and that's not their fault, because depression is not anybody's fault. The war is depression, and you have to have the iron will to win it.
My next question to you is when it was working for you, you're in survival mode, you are learning that this is how you're going to cope and teach. What was one thing, the first coping mechanism that worked for you brilliantly?
Changing my environment. So
Okay.
the thing with depression or suicidal ideation or panic attack or anxiety is that you're caught up in the moment of intrusive thoughts, ruminating thoughts. The most common problem is that we're sitting on the sofa, or we're lying on our bed, or we're sitting in front of a laptop, or we're on our phone. So the thoughts have got nowhere to go. They're just going to stay in your head. If you can change your environment and take yourself somewhere else, it just creates a little bit of distraction. It's not going to erase the depression, but it's just going to create some space from your thoughts. And there are a lot of other techniques as well, but that, for me, it's a go-to, because when you're, say, out in nature and you're walking through a forest, or you're sitting by a lake, or you're amongst trees or flowers, it calms the brain. It has a stimulatory effect on the brain. You just need to create a diversion from what's going on.
That's absolutely beautiful. And it makes so much sense. Distract yourself from your thought process, change your environment just as much as, as little as just getting up and walking around could help. Would I be correct in saying that?
Absolutely. And, not everyone has access to a lake or a waterfall. But the next best thing is just get out the house if you can. Because, as I said, you can still go for a walk and be heavily depressed, but it's better you're walking, moving your body, getting some fresh air than sitting at home.
I was running some research, and according to Australian Men's Health Forum, it said men are more likely to experience mental disorders in primary three categories, that is, anxiety, depression, and alcohol abuse, in comparison to women. Now, we're talking about, I asked you, and the environment and circumstantial problems that add to what a person is experiencing internally as well. When we are speaking of society and men, and specifically, what do you say are the triggers that are kind of not focusing on men or acknowledging men or driving them to these disorders more so than women?
Well, this is very interesting because I could apply this to my life totally
Mhm.
in conveying the answer. So, for instance, I had a dad who was larger than life. So he was very macho. He was loved and liked by everybody. He was revered by everybody. He was a massive personality. He gave to everyone. He was a hero. He was a war hero. And so that was a very tough act to follow. And I struggled for years to live up to that role. So I think one reason why mental illness and men is so synonymous is this need to be a man, this need to man up, this need to be the man of the house, this need to be macho. Men feel that if they become vulnerable, they're going to be perceived as weak. They're going to be perceived as, not a man. So that's why men are very reserved and reluctant to share their feelings. Although it's happening more and more, thankfully. But I think that's the main kind of issue behind the whole barrier and living up to potentially living up to strong father figures who possibly told them to, just get on with it and pull your socks up and try harder, fight back, do this, do that, do the other. And that all creates a massive amount of pressure for especially for a young boy. And it creates a huge sense of inadequacy. So I had these huge feelings of inadequacy because here was this great dad of mine and here was me. How was I going to live up to that?
Because as a coach, when I'm working with teens and young adults, this is one of those things that they mention, that father is usually using himself as an example. When I was your age, I've done this. When I was your age, I've done this. And the child is thinking, different time, different environment, different upbringing, and I'm in a completely different zone. Exactly that. How am I supposed to live up to those expectations?
Yeah.
And having said that, and it's interesting you've mentioned that men are afraid of showing their vulnerability, and that tends them, that triggers a tendency where they are not expressive of their emotions as much as they are expressive of anger. And if we really go in history, and when I'm looking at anger management classes, they're primarily men in those classes. So when they do express anything, that fear of vulnerability comes in with labels. They're attacked on their masculinity and otherwise. So even I feel the environment society is not very welcoming. Maybe we are trained that way throughout the world to not allow men that space. And I feel that translates into just one emotion, anger. Would I be correct in thinking that?
Yeah, and there are two other contributive factors
Yeah.
that I would add. The next one would be that men are generally not supported by their male counterparts, by their peer group, because again, how's it going to look? You know, how's it going to affect the image that we're portraying? And the other thing I would say is social media, and television, the images and the heroes that men aspire to be and that men follow. Again, it's chasing an impossible dream by looking up to potentially fictional characters that are portraying a certain image, that are portraying this person, and it's a complete illusion. But men get sucked into that. So when they watch someone on television, or they'll follow someone on social media, they're getting sort of sucked into that whole illusion. Guess what? That's that's the path they're going to take. As far as anger is concerned, I would say that I have a huge amount of anger, which I have a lot of tools to deal with. But anger is associated with depression. It's associated with trauma. Men's rage, especially as we're talking about men, I would say comes from life experience. It comes from what you've been through. I lost my parents when I was 25 years old. So I lost both my parents within a year of each other. And it just tore my world apart. You know, I doted on them. I was a devoted son. They meant the world to me. So these kind of things make you angry. They make you mad at the world. But that anger doesn't go away because you feel cheated. You feel cheated by life. You feel cheated by reality. And also, men's anger is constantly triggered. So even if I walk down the street and I see an elderly couple walking hand in hand, whilst, you know, it's nice to watch and it's very sweet, it's deeply upsetting because that's not a reality I had in my life. I wasn't able to have parents living to an old age. Or if I see grandparents playing with their children, with their grandchildren, that's not a reality I afforded. So I think a lot of things that happen in our life create this resentment. They create this bitterness. I need to find something that's going to deal with this anger. What shall I do? Shall I go and hit a punch bag? Shall I go for a run? Shall I talk to a friend? Shall I play some music? Shall I dance around the house? Whatever it takes. Anyone is capable of dealing with anger. But going back to what we were saying before, the wanting has to be there.
They would have been proud. They would have been proud to see that they have raised a young man who has gone out helping many others, utilizing your experience as you are. It's commendable, really. If you don't mind sharing, what were some of the coping mechanisms that help you primarily when it's about intensive anger or not reaching that stage of acceptance? And sometimes the anger looks like when somebody is throwing things and so on and so forth. But when it is in that intensified stage, what are some of the coping mechanisms that help men and they can hold it and control it better?
There's four things that spring to mind. So the first thing I would say, something that completely transformed my anger was a punch bag. It's extraordinary when you deal with your anger successfully. It's a revelation because you realize what actually anger is, and anger is essentially energy. It's stress, cortisol running rampant in your body. That's essentially what anger is. It can be perceived as a distorted emotion because anger makes people do horrific things. It's also needed sometimes to express and vent your frustration and anger. It's really important, but it's got to be done in the right environment. But I would say the number one tip for me to deal with my anger is when you make contact with something, you literally feel the anger evaporate. I could be in the foulest of moods. If I go and hit a bag for 20 minutes, it's gone. And that's no lie. All the anger's gone. And so you then realize that anger is a physical entity. Never communicate from a place of anger. So if you're feeling really angry about maybe the way you've been spoken to, or the way you've been treated, or something has said something, just give it some space, give it time to just work through your body, and then go and communicate whatever you need to communicate. But whenever you communicate from a place of anger, it's always a disaster. So that's just one quick tip that I always give people. I find that reframing works really well for anger. So when one feels angry about something, a lot of the time it can be reframed. You can change your perception towards what you're getting angry about, because anger is such an impulsive emotion. It's something that we can get triggered in a heartbeat. You know, you could be in a really great mood 1 minute and then be in this rage a minute later. And what that tells us is that we're dealing with something which quite powerless over. You know, we can't just say to ourselves, no, I'm not going to get angry, unless you have a lot of willpower. But especially for men, one great tool is to just take a breath, create some space, and just maybe go through in your head and break down what it is you're angry about. Journaling is a great way of doing that. Writing down your thoughts, your anxieties, your struggles, and then drawing a line and just trying to change your perceptions towards your struggles, because most perceptions can be changed. But for you to change those perceptions, you need to calm first. You need to calm yourself down first.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, the hardest for any human being. When you are in that rage, someone or some event has triggered you, that calming is again going to take a lot of will. That I need to calm down. I need to stop and breathe before I move forward. Now, earlier we were talking about being a young child and father figures. And, we're raising young men right now, but it is very important that their mental health is taken care of too right now. So, from that space, what is one thing, one advice you would give fathers, especially, that can help make the environment comfortable for their son to be more expressive and comfortable emotionally?
I think the most important thing you can do for your child would be to hold space for them, to establish a good line of communication, to create trust, establish trust, build trust. Because trust is at the core of relationships. Your son trusts you that you're going to, for instance, be confidential with a lot of the things that he's going to impart. Because this is a huge issue amongst especially teenagers, teenage boys, teenage girls, that the struggles they're communicating are not kept confidential. You know, one of the biggest mistakes they make is to confide in the wrong people. So they might go and tell their friends, they might open up to certain people about how they're feeling, and it backfires, as the person they're opening up to can go and tell the wrong person or talk behind their back, all that kind of thing. So going back to your question, I think it's so important to establish trust in your child that they can be open with you, that they can communicate with you. There has to be respect. And I know it's an old cliche, and some people subscribe to this, some don't, but respect does have to be earned. It has to be worked towards. One isn't going to achieve respect if they're not behaving well, if they're not a good parent or a good son. So it has to be worked at. The relationship has to be worked at. The communication has to be worked at. Now, one big issue is many young people struggle to open up. You know, depression makes one want to withdraw, and it makes one want to isolate, because depression feeds isolation and isolation feeds depression. there has to be a lot of education about how to deal with it. And there's a total, it's such a huge issue now, this inability to understand, this inability to validate, this inability to support. It's absolutely, it's a huge problem now.
It is. And that's the whole reason we're talking about it, because we want people to be more aware and get the right type of education where, before anything else, parents primarily can help their child and identify what needs to be done instead of saying, walk it off, because that does happen. Now, we're talking primarily about emotions and men emotions. And like we discussed before, and we've mentioned before, in the society, in today's time especially, we're really empowering women and talking about women, and men are, especially when we're talking about family dynamics, as a husband, as a father, even as a son. So in your opinion, what are emotional ordeals that are not being spoken about, men, that a lot of emotions are spoken about women, really, but where do we need to start the discussion about men and their emotional
I think
needs?
the first thing that needs to happen is that people need to educate themselves more. That's the first thing that needs to happen. And it's really easy now. You know, social media is absolutely chock-a-block with men talking about mental illness struggles. And yes, there are negative elements to social media, but there are a huge amount of positive elements to social media. Men on social media who have genuinely struggled with anxiety, panic attacks, depression, OCD, suicidal ideation, and they're getting online and they're communicating about it. And this is so powerful, for the reason that when a man opens up and is being real and is telling their story, it automatically has a healing effect on the recipient. Why? Because it takes away the feeling of isolation. It enables the person who's listening or watching to say, that's me. I'm going through that. I've gone through that. I have to say, a lot of the people that I've watched and listened to over the years, they have formed the root of a lot of my coping mechanisms. In terms of, when we talk about mental illness, it's what you're doing with your day, physically and cognitively. And I think one of the barriers is that there is so much toxicity on social media and on television. There are a lot of negative mindsets, and there are a lot of influencers who are not really going to inspire you. You know, find the podcasts that are going to inspire you. Find you know, people who are going to add something to your life, and it's all available. So I would say is, you know, knowledge is power. When we have the knowledge, we're 50% of the way there. You know, I would not be here if I didn't have a list of things, as long as your arm, that I know I can refer to make myself better. And that's all from acquiring knowledge.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power at the end of the day. And that is the knowledge that has been translated into wisdom and is being practiced. Otherwise, we are full of resources, we're full of knowledge, and yet a lot of people who have neglected to reach out for it. There was another research that I came across that 40% of the men don't talk about their mental health in today's time. And then, of course, there is a stigma, as we spoke earlier, about men showing vulnerability. My next question to you is, for men who are not ready to talk about it, who are listening to your story right now, what message do you have for them?
Mm. The message I would have is that depression is not a choice, but what is a choice is the wanting to reduce it. You know, there's no magic wand that can wave depression away or anxiety, but There are so many tools that you can create yourself a toolbox or a toolkit, whatever you want to call it, and you can have it for life, and it's going to get you through life. That's all I can say. Depression is all consuming, it's exhausting, it's debilitating, it's tough. There's got to come a point where you stand up to it. It's, we talk a lot about standing up to cancer, standing up to this, standing up to that. You have to stand up to your mental illness.
Conceive that will so you can go further and be better in your life. Now, I would like for you to chime into the coping mechanisms when it comes to preventing someone from falling into depression. Like, for instance, someone can tell that the sadness that they're experiencing, or the anger rather, being triggered from grief, or however it goes, like you have mentioned before from your experience. What can be one coping mechanism someone going through that feeling can implement that will help?
Distraction is the biggest enemy of depression, because what depression wants is for you to just feel complete overwhelm, lie in bed, don't get out of bed, don't shower, don't brush your teeth. That's what depression wants. It's sometimes useful to think of depression and sort of create this kind of character, try and create depression as this kind of separate entity which you have to deal with, because that way now you become the observer. Now the depression is not you, because when you're having a dark episode, it feels as though you are the depression. It feels as though all the focus is on the depression. Distraction throws depression. It throws it off, because now the depression's thinking, hang on, what's going on here? You're hoovering the house and I'm trying to make you depressed, right? So keeping busy, distracting yourself, is also sending a message to your brain. And what it is you're sending that message. Actually, I'm going to invest in myself now. I'm going to show up for myself now. So depression, it's not all about you anymore. It's now about me. So I'm going to go and tidy my room. I'm going to make it all nice and orderly, because I want to have an orderly head.
So interesting, because by distracting yourself and continuing doing what is important to you, rather, it's not just distraction, but cleaning the house, taking ownership of your own thoughts and mind. That's what I heard you say is the primary key. If I could just rephrase that. Now, that's how we can cope with depression or distract. And I love it that you said, see depression as a completely different entity, because in many ways, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about suicidal thoughts. We have just in recent times, especially here where I am in Dallas, Texas, had a lot of teenagers, especially boys, committing suicide.
Yeah.
Now, being someone who has experienced that, I would like to ask you, what is one of the coping mechanisms that can prevent that mindset in a young boy?
Just off the bat, what I would say is that I myself have experienced probably thousands of days of going through suicidal ideation. I could be pushing my trolley in the supermarket and just think, oh, I've had enough. So all I would say to you is that I'm still here with all that ideation. So if you think about that concept, what it tells you is that it's all thought. Suicidal ideation is thought. Now, thoughts can be very powerful. The people that tragically do go through with the act of suicide, sadly and tragically, they didn't have the tools to deal with these horrific thoughts. And it goes back to what we were saying before, that knowledge is power, and educating oneself is going to give yourself the edge. It's going to give yourself the tools to deal with these intrusive thoughts. Suicidal ideation is what I would term as a collection of distorted thinking. One of the greatest tools to control distorted thinking is meditation. Essentially, meditation, again, is a way of creating space. There are a number of guided meditations you can do now. You have to find one that resonates with you. But even if you're listening to a stimulating podcast, even if you're listening to your favorite piece of music, it's just, again, going back to that distraction idea. You just need to somehow create some space from these dark thoughts. What meditation does, or what listening to a podcast does, or what listening to some music does, or listening to sounds does, is it just creates a little bit of a diversion. And the idea is, if you can create a diversion for 60 seconds, just for 1 minute, you get through that minute, and then you get through the next minute. So it's 1 minute at a time, because a lot of suicidal ideation is exacerbated from thinking ahead, thinking about the future, feeling hopeless. Get out of that mindset, that futuristic mindset, and get present and ground yourself now. Don't worry about 5 minutes time. Don't worry about 1 hour's time. Let's just get through the next minute together.
That is brilliant, really. And I'm sure this is going to help a lot of our audience that are listening. Now, the core of the whole subject matter, what needs to change for men to feel that their emotions are also deserving of validation and should not be dismissed?
You know, whoever's listening right now, you matter. Why wouldn't you? You know, one of the most common things I hear is, I feel like I'm existing. I don't belong. I don't matter. I'm a burden. And the first thing I say to them is, why would you be a burden? Why you're saying that this person matters. So they might identify that this person matters and that person matters, but they don't matter. And I'll say, but why would they matter and you not matter? So I think that's the first message, is that you do matter. You are valued. Because everyone is. We all matter. We're all one consciousness. So I think that's probably the most important message. You know, this inner dialogue that you have, that you're a burden and that the world would be better off without you, it's just a total lie. It's a total lie. It's been fabricated by your brain, and you have to define it for what it is. It's a total mistruth. And the way you move forward is just to draw a line under that way of thinking and actually start repeating to yourself that you do matter, even if you don't feel it at first.
Because at the end, if we are not valuing ourselves, how can we show that value to someone else looking at us? That's brilliant. Now, David, after hearing your story and how you are helping others, if any of the audience members want to reach you, how can they reach you?
Sure. The best way is through my website, which is healyourgrief.co.uk, and everything's there. Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. So anyone wanting to communicate with David, go to that website, click, and you will get all the information you need. With that, don't forget to subscribe to Pondering Thoughts with Nida Javed. We will have more guests, more value, and a lot of thoughts coming your way. Again, thank you so much, David, for enlightening us, shedding light on this very important topic. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who will benefit from your story. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much.